Hello, dear students. Now we come to the second part of the lecture on women's writing, which is an introductory lecture. In the first part, we discussed how, through difficult times, women's writing gradually made a place for itself in the 19th century, and how those voices that had remained silenced for so many years or were unheard of finally started to make a presence. Still, as we speak about the 18th century and the response to women's writing, we have to understand this thing that in the 18th century, for the most part, the majority of people interested in reading and responding to works written by women were other women. One prime example of this is the book The Female Advocate, a poem occasioned by reading Mr. Duncombe's Feminine. It came out in 1774 by Mary Scott. The poem was Scott's first publication and is notable because it praises other women writers publishing at the time, including children's writer Sarah Fielding and Anna Letitia Bobwald, a writer whose political opinions eventually led to her being blacklisted after she published an inflammatory poem on her disagreement with the British Empire's involvement in the Napoleonic Wars. Dear students, here there are a few things that should be noticed very closely. The first is the fact that initially, primarily, it were women who were drawn towards women's literature. And as you see this first book, The Female Advocate, here also it is a kind of a response to what Mr. Duncombe had written in his book Feminine. Having said that, it is very important to note at the same time that there was a certain kind of support on part of Mary Scott to other women who were trying to write at that time and in fact were struggling. So you can see Sarah Fielding and Anna Letitia as an example, and who wrote books for children. And Mary Scott came forward to support them. And particularly Anna, she was criticized and imagine blacklisted by the people then, by the publishing industry then, because she happened to have a different kind of a stance from the British Empire's response to the Napoleonic Wars. Here also, we need to understand that this was the result of the patriarchal mindset, which thought that women did not have, in fact, did not have any wise or significant opinion, could not possibly have an opinion about serious matters like politics. Whatever that may be, still, it did not stop Anna from coming out with her criticism. And this, you can see, was just a beginning. Again, some years went by and no big voices were heard. But remember, friends, that if we do not come across any big names, say in a decade or two, it does not mean that a particular form of writing has ceased to exist. Because this is a kind of an undercurrent movement which goes on. There are multiple writers who make efforts, and there are only fortunate few who come to the normal eyes of the people. But even those writers who might not have been mentioned in history in any significant way, just by the effort that they were making, they formed a kind of a continuity in the tradition of writing. And the same applies to women's writing in general. Now you will see that after 19th century, after the end of 19th century, where we saw that most of the critics were very critical of women's stances, you will see a renewed kind of interest suddenly with the publication of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own in 1929. And to a great extent, this book by Virginia Woolf is considered to be a driving force behind, say, feminism, the feminist movement, or women's writing in general. Now, considered by many to be Woolf's masterwork, the long form essay is told through a fictionalized narrator and presents an argument on the necessity of both a metaphorical and literal room for women's literature within the literary tradition. Dear students, this is the central statement of the book, not only of the book, but the entire corpus of women's writing, whereby they demand a room for of their own, both metaphorically and literally. Now let's understand what do they mean by metaphorical, having metaphorical room and a real room. When we speak of a room, we speak of a space. If we are living in a family, we live in a house, everyone is supposed to have a room of his or her own. But you will see that in those days, and in many cases, even these days, there are no rooms as such which are assigned to individual women. So women are present in almost every room, but they do not have a room of their own. The bedroom is shared by husband and maybe children. In the West, just the husband and the other spaces. But there is always a woman is not just a gender, she is also an individual. So, physically, also, she needs a space of her own. And in the same way, if we speak about interests, inclinations, having free time of your own, having thoughts of your own, even then you need some kind of a space whereby you can be with yourself, spend some time with yourself. Now, these two basic things, they form the basis of the entire feminist movement and women's writing in general, whereby they make a demand to have a space of their own, which is not overshadowed or pre-designed or pre-designated by the patriarchal structure. Now, this book by Virginia Woolf, it became an inspiration for the literary journal Room. It was formerly titled Room of One's Own, and the journal was launched in 1975. But you can see that there is a lot of, say, 3, 4 decades between when Virginia published her book and this journal started, that you can see that it's not easy to literary movements spread like wildfire, but it does not also mean that it was going very slow. But this movement was gradually gaining ground. Howsoever slowly, it was making a space of its own. So, in the second wave of feminism in, say, the 70s and 80s, it sparked a resurgence in forging a place for the works of women. Colleges began offering courses in women's history and literature, and presses were founded that dedicated themselves to publishing lost or ignored works by women. But, friends, remember, this was never too easy. There were too many condescending approaches and critical also and dismissive also. But these women, they knew that they needed a space, a room of their own, and no less than the kind of space that men claim themselves in the entire society. In recent years, a greater emphasis on intersectionality has encouraged exploration into the relationship between race, gender, religion, and class to even further prove the importance of the acknowledgement of the place of marginalized groups in literature. Here, dear friends, we have to understand one thing, that it broadens the scope and the horizons of women's writing. Now, if we take as marginalization of women as our basic premise, we will realize that it's not just women who have been marginalized in terms of gender, but there are larger questions. Say, I won't exactly say larger, but there are questions of equal importance, like race, religion, class. So if you put these things together, and there are women who go from one group to another, and there are women who might, who might be marginalized in multiple ways by belonging to a certain race, by belonging to a gender, a religion, or a class. So this gives a bigger kind of scope for women's writing in general. When we look at writers like Toni Morrison, Adrienne Rich, and Margaret Atwood, whose works exemplify the need for acknowledgement and activism, prove that there is a place for this dialogue and that a room of one's own benefits not only women but the literary tradition as a whole. How does it help as a whole? It helps as a whole because, see, if there is a race, say for instance, black people, if they are marginalized in a specific way, just because of the color of their skin or whatever presumptions the white people might have about them, if they come across women's literature, they will find that the patterns of marginalization remain almost the same. So these different groups, marginalized groups, whether they are marginalized for one reason or the other, they can seek some kind of solidarity because their pain and their discrimination at many places, it sounds similar. And so can their struggle be.